Hello, listeners. It's Stu. I'm here with author, paranormal investigator, and the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great, Stu, and I'm so excited to be doing this with you right now. I'm really happy that we're going to be doing the shows.
Oh, me too. This is, as a listener or former listener, I miss them a great deal. So I'm really happy to be a part of this. So, what do you have for us in this episode?
Well, tonight I thought we would talk a little bit about phone calls from the dead. I've always been fascinated with the subject matter of electronics and how spirits are using electronics to communicate with us. And it's as old as spirit communication. They tried with recorders and what have you. And if you go way, way back, the recording of voices was the first electronic device that was used, and it was an accident. The first one was actually the guy's name was Radov, and he was recording bird songs. And he got a voice that turned out to be his father, who had been dead for a while. And the
Wow.
message
Hmm.
was very personal to him. It was something that it was his
Hmm.
nickname that his daddy used to call him when he was a little kid. And that's what started the concept of that. But since then, I have to tell you, as we've progressed with technology, apparently our dead people are keeping up with us because they're reaching out from,
Hmm.
from beyond in so many ways. And, um, in my very first book, I told a story about a woman who received some phone calls from the dead, and that's always fascinated me. So I thought I'd bring some stories that I found really compelling
Okay.
tonight.
I'm sure me and everybody else will love to hear them.
Well, the first one I wanted to tell was the story of a guy named Charles Peck. Now, this story is really interesting um, because it just defies explanation in so many ways. So Charles was a on a train out in California, and um, the train basically crashed. It's
Hmm.
sad story in that respect. So um, the train crashed in the San Fernando Valley. There was 25 people killed. This would have been September the 12th of 2008. Now, among those killed was Charles. He's a 49-year-old guy. He's got a lot to live for, adult kids, a new fiance, the whole 9 yards. Later on, it would be determined he died on impact. But this is what makes this story interesting,
Okay.
and not just tragic. It is tragic, but not just tragic. So there's 11 hours that he's missing after the train accident. They can't find his body. And there's a lot of crushed metal and stuff that has to be moved, and they're
Hmm.
not able to find his body right away. During that 11-hour period, there were 35 phone calls made to his loved ones from that phone. Now, none of them had any words in it. It was just static. But at the time, they were obviously in contact with the officials, and they were telling them, no, he's still alive. He has to be alive. We're getting phone calls from him.
Hmm.
And they believed that, and they were using that as their reason to have hope that he was alive somewhere in the wreckage, dialing but not able to speak. And then the phone would go dead, and then he would dial again in a few minutes.
Hmm.
And it was a very logical assumption, except that when they finally got to him, they realized he had died on impact. And those 11 hours, he could not have been making those phone calls.
Wow.
I just find that story so fascinating, somehow it's obviously tragic, and
Hmm.
yet heartening that he still was trying to reach out to talk to them, to tell them something, to let them know he was still thinking of them. He was actually found in the very first train car, which was obviously one of the focal points of the crash. um, there's not even any proof that they ever found his phone at all. It
Oh,
wasn't found.
yeah,
Yeah, it
that was
wasn't.
going to be my question. Did they find the phone and did they have, all those outgoing calls?
It did. They did not, to the best of my ability to tell, they did not find the phone. It wasn't on him, which would negate the idea that maybe he didn't die on impact, as even though that's what the coroner said.
Mhm.
And then he just laid there and dialed over and over again. So to the best of my ability to tell, the police never released any information that they did find the phone. So I don't know if it was on his end, but they did find the phone calls on the loved one's end. They did show up as real phone calls
Mhm. From his phone.
from his phone.
Mhm.
I know it's quite a story, isn't it?
Well, from things that that I've read and things that I've seen, I think anything is possible.
The older I get and the more I've grown in the paranormal world, the
Mhm.
more I believe that at myself that anything is possible, that the human spirit just goes beyond anything we can even imagine. I've, had so many amazing um, stories come to me. I just had one recently come to me, and I won't name the family because the death is very recent, but a family that's
Mhm.
from central Pennsylvania, and the young man died. And according to family friends, they've had some suspicions that he might have lingered here, just for things that are moved and stuff that's just not quite right. Well, eventually, his family had to continue living, so they decided to clean out his bedroom and give it to one of the other children. And on his mom had her phone set up so that you know how on these new cars you can like read the text on a screen as you're driving.
I don't have anything that modern.
Me either. I drive a 2002. I like old cars, and if I had my way, I'd drive a 1960 something or other. But anyway, you can. And she had just told the one daughter she could have the room, and she got in the car to go somewhere, and on the screen popped up my room, my room. And she took it as meaning that he was reaching out to her to say he objected. It was
Hmm.
still his room.
Hmm. That's pretty cool too.
It just is. I find the whole thing so fascinating.
I'm sure if I was there, I get chills, because when I have experiences, in fact, the first thing I do is show my wife. I get like, the hair on my arms is just standing straight up, but I feel exhilarated too whenever I experience something like something paranormal. So it's yeah, I can just imagine what she felt. But then you're going to keep that room forever as a shrine to the
Right.
poor boy, but is that what he wanted? Yeah.
I kind of wondered if it was maybe sibling rivalry.
Hmm.
Because, kids being kids, don't give it to her. It's my room.
Yeah.
And apparently he was a bit of a prankster, so that might have been part of it as well. But I just thought it was really interesting. Some of his friends reached out to me and told me this story, and they were like, "What do you make of it?" And I'm like, "Well, I wasn't there, so I can't tell you, but it sounds compelling.
Hmm.
That it certainly could. It makes sense. It's in context with him and his character, and it's pretty good coincidence that it was the very same afternoon that she said, 'Yeah, go ahead and take the room.'"
Hmm. Either that or somebody's playing a pretty elaborate prank, and that's
I would have to say that would be a very elaborate prank. And the only person that I know that could pull that off was the person telling me the story, and he was pretty rattled by it
hmm.
because he's like, he's like, I don't know how that could have happened. And I'm sure that from him, I know him very well, and I'm from his reaction, he was really rattled.
Hmm.
So I found it really an interesting story. To me, it's a hopeful story because I believe with all my heart and soul, obviously, because I am a paranormal person, that we don't just stop existing. We just change form. So the essence of who we are, our quirkiness, our pranksterness, all that stuff lingers on with us. And I think this is a great example of how that happens. So, so it's one of
That's
my
mhm.
go ahead.
No, I said, yeah, wonderful story. Yeah.
So my next story is about author Dean Koontz. Now he's from Bedford. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I didn't because I know. Well, I'm a lifelong. Well, as long as he's been writing, Dean Koontz fan, and I believe I have every one of his books in some form, whether it be hardback, paperback, or ebook format. So, and yeah, but as long as I've been reading him, I thought he was from California, so I didn't
No,
realize
he lives.
his
Yeah,
origins was Bedford.
he lives in California now, but he grew up in Bedford. And he still from time to time over the years will come back from to visit family and what have you in this area. But anyhow, the
Mhm.
story is one that he told about something that happened to him. So his mother had passed away, and his father was in a facility. He doesn't say specifically, but it sounds like he might have had dementia and was in a nursing facility.
Mhm.
So on September the 20th of 1988, Mr. Koontz received a phone call from a female voice, and the voice said, "Please be careful." It was very distant and kind of hollowed out, but it said the words, "Please be careful," 3 times, and he was almost positive it was his mother. It sounded very much like her voice.
Mhm.
And that's, I mean, speaking as, I'm sure you're the same as I am. I can tell you my mother's voice, the cadence of her voice, I could pick it
Mhm.
out anywhere for the rest of my life.
You-
So I'm going with Dean saying it's his mom.
mhm.
Now, his mother had been dead for 20 years at this point, so it had been a while. Now, 2 days later, he goes over to visit his dad at a facility, and that's all he ever refers to it as. But it's then, like I said, I think it was probably from the
Mhm.
sound of things, a nursing facility, and dad must have had some form of dementia. And his dad was having some behavioral problems, which happens with dementia. And he had attacked another resident. So,
Oh.
Mr. Koontz goes over and he's trying to talk to his dad, and he's trying to sort this whole thing out. And when he goes to see into his dad's room, his dad has a knife in a drawer. And he wants to take the knife away from his father, obviously, and he tries to, and
Mhm.
him and his dad kind of wrestle, and he gets the knife from his father. The facility calls the police, and the police arrive. And as they arrive, Dean has the knife in his hand, and he's going into the hallway. Well, all they're told on the from the telephone call for the police was, "There's a man with a knife,"
Mhm.
and of course, there's
He
a
fit
man
the
with a knife.
description. Yep.
Yeah. So they immediately think he's the perpetrator, and they tell him, "Drop the knife, drop the knife, drop the knife," and he stops and he drops the knife because he was afraid they were going to shoot him. They had guns drawn,
Mhm.
and the situation gets explained and everybody understands it. And after this whole situation's over, he starts to think, was that his mom saying to him, be careful,
Mhm.
please be careful, because she knew this was coming up, and she was trying to warn him of either the knife or of the situation with the police, but one of the two. And he was completely convinced that this was his mother who had been, there warning him so that he would be careful and nothing would happen.
That's interesting, and that makes me think of a question though, because you mentioned, like, after someone dies, if their spirit lingers, they maintain their personality, so whether they were a joke or whatnot. But how could someone who was deceased know something that was going to happen unless perhaps they were precognitive while they were alive?
That's a good question. I've never thought of that. That's
Hmm.
good.
Hmm.
Um, the truth is, I honestly don't know, but they do seem to sometimes have that foreknowledge. It's not a story of um, communication from a phone call, but there's a story that has always stuck in my head, and I wrote about it in Where Dead Men Walk, and that is the story about a young woman, and she's in Colorado, and she's going down one of those really steep mountains,
Hmm.
and her brakes go out, and she's totally panicked. I can't even imagine going down one of those long, steep mountains and you suddenly don't have any brakes, and she's trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. And oh my God, I'm going to crash. And she doesn't want to go over the side that would take her down over the cliff. And so she's trying to run options in her head all at the same time. And it's just, zoom, zoom, zoom. She comes up with this very frightening idea that as the car goes around a turn, she's going to jump out of it and it's going to careen down the hill. And so maybe she'll get a broken arm or something, but she has a chance at surviving. So she gets ready, and as the car's headed, down this curve and she's trying to steer
Hmm.
it, she's thinking, I'll hit the hill, it'll slow down for a second, and I'll jump out. And then just as she goes to open the door, she hears this voice say, "Don't you dare, shut that door." And she slams the door shut and she grabs a hold of the steering wheel and she keeps on going. And she gets to the bottom and she does have an accident. She hits something, but
Hmm.
it's not a horrible accident. She walks away from it. And she told the police officer later that she had been thinking about jumping out of the car, and he's like, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you didn't do that, because you would have been sucked underneath the vehicle and run over."
Mm.
And he said, "What made you change your mind?" And it's before she could think about it, she said, "My father yelled at me and told me to shut the car door." It was her father's voice.
Hmm.
So, how he knew she needed him in that moment, I don't know, but maybe that connect with us. I mean, so I don't know about you, but like my mom and I were so connected. I'd pick up the phone to call her, and as I'm dialing the number, she's yelling, "Pat, Pat, I'm already on the phone." And I'm like, "Oh, hi, Mom. I didn't even get to call you yet." You know?
Hmm.
So maybe it's just that emotional connection we have to our loved ones. But yeah, I found that story of Dean Koontz is quite compelling.
I find his books quite compelling as well. So
I do as well. I've read. I can't tell you I'm as big a fan as you. I haven't read all of his books. But he and Stephen King were probably two of my favorite writers growing up.
hmm, I can say the same thing about King.
And then I started into nonfiction more than as I got into my late teens, and then I started reading more about like Elliot O'Donnell and different other researchers and writers and things like that. And I started to I can't tell you I haven't read a King book or a Dean Koontz book for years, just because I'm always reading for work, because I'm always writing.
Hmm.
But Dr. Hans Holzer's books and stuff like that compelled me. But my favorite author of all time is probably Elliot O'Donnell, and
Hmm.
I will always like him. He's a third generation ghost hunter from England, and he came here at the turn of the 20th century. And his books are just collections of short stories. And those who've read my books know my books are collections of short stories. And I loved the way he wrote, and I loved the subject material. So he ended up being one of my heroes.
I will have to look those up because, as a young kid having paranormal experiences, I became fascinated in the topic. So, in elementary school, like I remember in third grade, I was reading on an eighth grade level. And, like the whole library was open to me. And I remember reading A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle and 2001 A Space Odyssey. I was reading these in elementary school.
Wow.
And stuff like that just completely fascinated me. So, yeah, anything having to do with ghosts, science fiction, anything space, that was my bailiwick. That's what I like to read. So, but I definitely want to check out that author.
Yeah, you can still find his books. Like if you look for the used ones, I don't think there's any newer printed versions that you can get. But I fell in love with his books. I found my first one when I was 12 years old, maybe.
Hmm.
And I remember when I started reading it, I couldn't put it down, and I remember laying it down one night and thinking, this is who I want to be. And I've never stopped wanting to
Hmm.
be like him, because he told a whale of a tale. Great stories, very intense, never skimped on the detail. I really like them.
Very nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, there is nothing like holding a hardbound book, but being the tech guy that I am, if it's available in an EPUB format, that way I can read it laying in bed at night without having my light turned on because the screen's lit. I'll do that and fall asleep reading that way.
I have certain books I can read that way, and then I have other books that I just need to hold. And I still have that book I found when I was 12.
Oh my, yeah.
I have the original, that copy, and every
Mm,
so often she gets it pulled out, and I visit my old friend Elliot,
mm.
and and I just lay there and hold that book, and I'm 12 years old, laying under the blankets trying to read before my mom catches me again.
Yeah. Oh my. Off topic, I know, but still, yeah.
It's part of our lives and who we are and why we do
Mhm,
what we do. So.
mhm,
So I had told you the story about the young man. I had found another story that I thought was kind of interesting, and it was a
mhm,
story about a young guy who passed away, and a few weeks after he had died, his best friend got a phone call, and he answered the phone, and the person said, "Hey, is it's so and so." The young man's name is Joe that died. "Hey, it's Joe. Is Jeremy there?" Meaning his best friend. And his Jeremy's mother had answered the phone, and she's like, "No, no." And she's kind of trying to run this through her head because she knows this kid
mhm,
had died. And I'm sure her first thought was prank. Um, and
mhm,
then the hot phone just kind of went dead. It didn't really sound like it hung up. It just went dead. And she told her son about it when he came home, and she's like, "Just so if you get this phone call, you don't panic. I think somebody's trying to prank you, and it's just a terrible prank." And sure enough, the phone call came again later that night. This time, Jeremy answers the phone, and it just says, "Hey, it's Joe," and then the phone goes dead. Well, the kid checks it out. It's on his cell phone, so he looks, and it just says "out of area" on the phone. And he tried to call it up. He couldn't get anything like that. But after that, um, there were no more phone calls. Nobody ever owned it. Nobody ever used it as part of a prank to say, "Hey, something crazy happened to you," or anything like that. It just that one day.
mhm.
It was as though he was reaching out from wherever to talk to his friend or say goodbye to his friend. And I just thought it was a really interesting story, because those are the kind of stories that I hear a lot. And not just phones. I will tell one. It's not a phone call story exactly, but it's a really interesting, I think, a really interesting story. I've told it a couple other places, but it's still worth telling if we're going to do stories of electronic devices being used as a communication. Years ago, I have a girlfriend, and her name is Lois, and years ago, um, she had a friend whose husband bought a used computer, and this is back in the dial-up days, so I'm talking dinosaur era,
Mhm,
you know. And you remember how they used to do that do 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 thing whenever they
mhm,
would start to connect. So they bought this computer used, and they hooked it up in their extra bedroom, and it would, when they would connect to the internet, it would do the do 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 thing, and that was the only time you'd ever hear it. And as it was trying to connect, there was you could program some of them so that they'd play like a little song to kind of fill that little lull while it's trying to work its way through the process. And but they didn't program it to do anything like that. So anyhow, um, they only had it in the house 2 or 3 nights when all of a sudden she woke up in the middle of the night. She hears the computer connecting in the other room, rolls over, and her husband's laying in bed. There's nobody else in this house. And she's like, "What is going on?" So she gets up, goes over. Sure enough, the computer is starting to connect. And then as soon as it connects, it starts playing the theme song to the Lone Ranger. And she's like, "That is just weird." So she flips it off, goes back to bed. And this happens multiple times throughout the next couple weeks. In the middle of the night, she hears it connecting, gets up, it starts to play the theme song for the Lone Ranger, and then she turns it off, or it stops itself and goes off. And they think there's something wrong with it. So they take it to a computer guy and they say, "Look, this thing's crazy. It's got some sort of short or something in it." Guy looks through it and he's like, "No, this thing's perfectly fine. You really got a good deal. Take it home." Same thing happens. And one day she says, she starts saying something to her family about it, somebody in her family, her aunts or something, and they're like, that's just really strange. And she said, you know what's really strange beyond that is I keep having the same dream right before this happens. And it's this dream about this woman. And I know she looks vaguely familiar, but I don't know who she is. She walks in and she touches my chest. It's always the same breast. And she puts her hand there and says, be careful. And then I wake up, I hear that Lone Ranger theme song when I get up, and it's just very weird. And I don't know why, but I connect the two things, the dream and the song. And her aunt just about drops her coffee cup. She's like, tell me what she looks like. And she's like, well, she describes her. And the aunt jumps up, she goes over and she pulls out these old photo albums, starts flipping through them. And she's like, there's a group of them as young people. And she's like, is the girl in here? And yeah, she says, that's the girl. And she points to this one young woman. And her aunt starts crying. She's like, oh my God. It turns out that this was one of this woman's aunts, but she had died in her very, very early 20s, long before this woman was ever born. She knew of her, but she really didn't know anything about her. She may have seen a picture of her in an old photo album a couple times, but it didn't connect. And it turns out that her favorite cereal was Lone Ranger cereal, which apparently was a thing in the 60s. And she would eat it all the time, and they would always tease her about it and do the Lone Ranger theme song and stuff,
Hmm.
because she was always eating all the boxes of the cereal. And she died of breast cancer.
No.
So this woman went to the doctor, and she said it sounded insane, but she went and she had herself checked, and she had a small mass. And the doctor's like, I am so glad you caught this so early. And she's like, I can't even believe you felt it. It's so small. It was like tinier than the tip of your pinky. And she's like, well, somebody told me I should probably get myself checked. And she said she truly believes that her aunt came through and knew what was coming on, and so she tried to get her attention, and the only ways she could do it was through the dream and then the song to let her know, this is me,
Hmm.
and I'm trying to help you, so go get help.
That's pretty bizarre.
It is bizarre. But my girlfriend called me and she's
Uh-huh.
like, oh my God, you got to hear this story. So she had me connect with her friend it happened to. And the woman was just, she said to me, she saved my life. I know she did. And I believe she's right.
Yeah, being a tech guy, again, the first thing I go to is, okay, the modem was set up to auto answer, but if you had the modem sharing the same phone line, unless it had a dedicated phone line, right? So if it was sharing the same family's phone line, if an incoming call came, you'd hear the phone ring in the house.
Right.
Unless that never happened, it couldn't have been an incoming call. And unless there was some program on the machine designed to make it dial out at a certain time, or even, I mean, computers of that era, you could configure them to power on at a certain time.
Well, see, that's what they wanted to do. That's why they had the guy come check it out. They
Right,
thought that because it was used, somebody else had done that and they just
right.
didn't know about it. That was their first thought.
Mhm.
But apparently he said that wasn't what was going on.
I don't want to detract from the story. It's just,
No,
that
no, that's fair.
that's my troubleshooting nature coming through.
No, actually, when we're doing a paranormal investigation, the thing we do is exactly that. We're running through all the possible logical explanations because they have to be gone through before you can go with what's left over. So that makes perfect sense to me that you'd run through that. But that's why her husband had somebody who was a computer person that worked on them come in and look it over and see what was going on. And this is before she realized the connections. And the guy was like, no, there's nothing wrong with this computer, and it shouldn't be turning itself on in the middle of the night.
Hmm. And even if it was programmed, it would be exactly the same time every night too. So.
Yeah. No, I don't think it was exactly the same time. It was like, it was in the middle of the night, but it was
Mhm.
odd moments. It wasn't exactly the same time, I don't believe.
Not 3 a.m. like the Lutz family.
No, not like the Let's family. Not always, at least. I don't know if it ever was at 3 a.m., but certainly not like every time.
Mhm.
Yeah, that kind of gave 3 a.m. a really bad rap. And I've had people that'll ghost hunt and they'll say, you must do it at 3 a.m. because that's when the spirits are the strongest. And I'm like, at 3 a.m., I'm in my bed.
Hmm.
And, they can just wait if that's the only time I can ghost hunt, because you
Hmm.
can ghost hunt anytime. So I found one. It was from the United Kingdom. I just thought it was interesting that, this isn't just a localized United States phenomena. This happens all over the world. Literally, I could give you hundreds and hundreds of stories, but I found this one kind of compelling because it was just an interesting little twist to it. So there's this group of friends that rented a cottage that was owned by one of the friends' grandfathers. It was in a kind of isolated area, and they thought, well, we'll just go and hang out. Spend a couple nights and kind of a little mini vacation type thing, all hang out together and spend a little time. And it was pretty modern. It had electricity and hot water and all that good stuff, but it didn't have like central heat and all that other things. So they kind of came out and kind of were going to rough it for a while. They decided they were going to stay over the Easter weekend, and they just kind of hung out, laughed, talked, had a good time. But on Saturday morning, they decided to go to the market and then grab lunch at this little restaurant, this pub in town. So they're sitting in town and they're eating when somebody comes up to them, and they realize it's a friend of theirs that they had invited, who had said that he couldn't get there. He wasn't going to be able to make it.
Hmm.
And the friend sits down. He's like, "Hey, I'm so glad I didn't miss you. I'm really glad I caught you just before you left." And blah blah blah. And they start talking. They're like, "How did you know we were here?" And he's like, "Oh, the lady on the phone. I called the house, and the lady on the phone, I guess she's the housekeeper. She said you guys were in town at this," and he named the restaurant. And she said if I hurried, I'd be able to catch you. And they're like, "There's nobody at the house." So no, no, I talked to a lady. I thought she was like the housekeeper or something. And the person whose grandfather owned it, he's like, "No, my grandfather doesn't have a housekeeper, and he's never paid for anybody to come and clean the place. I don't know what you're talking about." Well, they went back and they actually ended up calling Grandpap and asking just to make sure. There was nobody there, but somebody answered the phone that day and gave this guy specific instructions on how to get there so he didn't miss lunch with his friends.
Hmm. All
So
the
not only,
stories so far have been helpful.
well, they are, and that's the thing I think about paranormal that people don't realize is that probably 98% of the paranormal stories I know are really, really nice stories. I don't, you rarely come across a really terrible one. I don't know why Hollywood tends to only pick those stories that are sensational, but they do. It's just kind of sad that they don't let you know that a lot of the stories are helpful ghosts, communicating for some good reason. I hear many, many more of those than I do of the other kind, and I hope my books reflect that, because a lot of my stories are definitely
Hmm.
spirits reaching out into the lives of their loved ones in particular, and trying to help people from beyond the dead. And I like that. I think that's awesome that that's really what we do when we die. We,
Well, if it's a reflection of who we are when we were alive, that means there's a lot of good people.
exactly. That's why, people say, well, what about, evil people and all this? Well, we all get to meet bad people sometimes, but truly evil people, most of us never really encounter that. And I'm grateful for it. I'm talking like, Ted Bundy's and really evil people. Most of us never have that experience, and that's awesome. We just meet normal cranky people, and there's cranky ghosts. There are cranky ghosts that'll be, scrappy little things, but
Mm.
they're not setting out to destroy your life. So, I think that tells you a lot about who we are and what we do when we pass on. We reach out to our loved ones, we reach out to the living and try to give them some help or support rather than trying to cause them grief. I don't think any of the stories that we have today are actually about anything grief wise. So I have another really nice story. that
I'd
I'll
love
share
to
with
hear
you.
it.
This one came from the late 1990s. There was a gentleman who had lived a very long life. He was almost 100 years old when he passed away, and his children and grandchildren were, kind of taking care of him. They left him stay at home, but they would come in and take turns rotating to have somebody with him all the time. And he was struggling. He had a lot of pain toward the end of his life and what have you. And even though they were so sorry to see him pass, there was also that relief.
Hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
I
Where
do.
thank goodness he's not in pain anymore, because he was struggling a lot. And at his funeral, there weren't a lot of friends or anything, because he was almost 100 years old. There weren't a whole lot of people left of his contemporary group of people that could be there. So it was mostly his children and grandchildren who attended his funeral. After the funeral, they all went to the one family member's house, the one daughter's house, and had dinner, and were just kind of remembering, um, grandpa and all of this. And that evening, their phones kept ringing, and they'd answer them, and there's just nothing there, and it was some sort of a glitch or something. They thought, maybe some weird signal or something like that. And the daughter who was hosting everybody that night, she had a one of the phones that had the caller ID on them, and her calls were coming in on that one. So she hit the caller ID to see who called, and it came up her dad's phone number as though it was from his house.
Hmm.
And that was crazy. So she started thinking, I wonder if somebody broke into the house, or somebody's playing a dirty prank. So she keeps letting the machine pick them up for a little while, and then she finally, her and her siblings decide they're going over to the house and just make sure of what's going on. So they go over, they look around. The house is all cleaned up and everything's fine. It's locked up tight. Nobody seems to be there. There's no indication that anybody's been messing around in the house. And so they go back home, and they've talked about it, and they're kind of weirded out by the whole thing. And she realizes when she gets up the next day that the last two phone calls from her dad's house she had not listened to. Those calls came in, she saw them on caller ID, and that's when they said, we're going over. So she presses the button to clear them, and then you have to listen to them to clear them. And she hears her father's voice on the one call, and it says, Maggie, I'm okay. Your mom's with me. I want you to know it's all good.
A little bit of reassurance from the afterlife. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was just beautiful. And she said when they interviewed her that the first part of it was a little faint, hearing her dad's voice, but as he started to speak, his voice grew a little stronger, and she took it as him, comforting them, saying, it's good, I'm with your mom, and it's all right. You don't have to grieve for me. I'm okay. And again, I think that's really what we end up with when we pass away, is we want to comfort our living people. We want to let them know we're all right. It's okay to let us go. And it's important that we let them go, because we can hold them here with our grief. And they want us to know it's all right. We're fine. In one way or another. I mean, not everybody's got a phone call from the dead, but we get confirmations in our own way. I have a dear friend who always would always collect experiences with cardinals. Like, they would go out in the woods, her and her mom, and they would take walks and count how many red birds they saw, and all this. It became kind of a personal thing for them. And then when mom died, she was kind of grieving about it, and she said one night she saw this cardinal, and it was sitting on the window pecking. And that's just so weird. That's not what they do. And she shushed the bird away, thinking, you're going to break the glass. And the bird came fluttering back up and tapped on the window again. and she shushed it away the second time, and it came back on third, and she said, "Mom, is that you?" And the bird topped its head sideways, and looked at her, pecked on the window, and flew away. And she said, "I knew it was my mom saying,
Mm.
I'm always going to be with you." But I love that story. I have a friend whose grandmother was from England, and they have a legend about cardinals, that they're the most beautiful bird, and that because of that they can fly up and sit on God's shoulder. And if you tell a cardinal a prayer or wish, and that you are sincere with it, he'll fly up and whisper it to God.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
I know, I love that. So we give each other cardinal things all the time, just to, as a
Mm-hmm.
reminder. But I love that story.
Mm-hmm.
So I have one last story I'd like to share tonight.
All
And
right.
I think
Mm-hmm.
this is, in a lot of ways, this is my favorite story. I did a lot of work with people who had dementia and Alzheimer's when I was younger, and I grew to love them so much. And the essence of that kind of comes through in this story. So this story comes from Reno, Nevada, from the 911 service in Reno, Nevada. So
Okay.
that gives you a context for the
Mm-hmm.
caliber of people we're talking about. So there was this old couple that lived in a house about 20, 23 miles, something like that, outside of Reno, but they were part of the call center territory. And at least 2 or 3 times a week, the elderly lady she would call, and she would say things like, I need help turning my thermostat up, or I need you to make me some tea. And they knew her story, that
Okay.
her
Right.
husband had died, and she was struggling living by herself and was getting a little dotty.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, the dementia got worse, as it does, and the phone calls took a different turn. After a little while, the phone calls all were for her husband, John, as though she were calling him. And she would call and she'd say, John, I need your help. You need to come home. I need you now, and stuff like that. Now they all had pity on this lady. And so, they would just say, this is the 911 service, ma'am, and you need to call if you have an emergency, and we can't help you, sweetheart. John's not here.
Mm-hmm.
And they would try to calm her down. And everybody that worked there knew this old lady and her voice. She was, an ever-present part of the system. She called
Mm-hmm.
sometimes almost daily. And she didn't have any family or anything like that. So they just sort of tolerated it. They never went out to see what was going on, because she never said there was an emergency. So they couldn't
Mm-hmm.
justify going out, but they would calm her down and ask her questions. And, so, why don't you walk over to the thermostat? I'll tell you how to turn it up. Stuff
Okay.
like that, just trying to be
Mm-hmm.
decent, nice to her. And then a neighbor called one day and said that he hadn't seen her in quite a while. And he said, I think there might be a problem. Somebody needs to come out and do a wellness check. Well, when they did the wellness check, they came to find that she had been deceased for several days, laying in her bed. And the word quickly spread to the 911 operators that their little caller had died.
Mm-hmm.
And, they were kind of sorry, but they were also kind of at peace with the fact that she wasn't struggling so hard anymore. Until a couple nights after her death, when somebody got a phone call, and it was her on the 911 system saying, John, I need your help. And this went on for almost a year after she died. In fact, about 4 months after she died, some kids in the area set the house on fire. So there wasn't any house. And she still continued to call. They checked the telephone company, and the company said the house phone had been turned off almost immediately after she'd been found. There was no way that anybody tapped the line. This just went on and on and on. This went on so long that eventually the 911 service released a couple of the tapes and told the story about this woman themselves. That's where this actually came from a newspaper article where they were being interviewed, of course, in October near Halloween,
Hmm.
and they were asked about what was the strangest thing that ever happened, and the operator said it had to be our little old lady because she called for a year.
And they have the tapes. They got the evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just thought, for me, because I could see an elderly lady with Alzheimer's or dementia, struggling and reaching out thinking that number was her husband and being really confused. And even after she passed away, apparently that confusion stayed and remained. And so instead of leaving and passing on to where she needed to go, she was still trying to get help and get her husband.
Hmm. That's sad.
It is sad. I can only hope that eventually he got through to her
Hmm.
and took her by the hand and led her where she needed to go, because she did eventually stop.
Hmm.
So that's my hope for that one. But I just found some of these stories just amazing, and they're in their own way they're beautiful to me because they are telling us that we survive, that our hearts survive, that our love survives. That's not the lesson the
Hmm.
paranormal usually teaches people. They want to hear the creepy stories. And I like a good creepy story. I'm not going to
Hmm.
lie. But I also love these stories because these are real stories of real people.
Hmm.
So, any thoughts, my dear?
Well, I always have lots of thoughts, but
Well, sure.
on topic, no. No, other than the fact I'm just sitting back and enjoying the tales. That's just, and this is better than, because I do have a number of your books,
Oh,
and
thank you.
okay, and I urge our listeners and viewers to also experience Patty Wilson through the printed page. So, but anyway, and not just this form, but it's just like whenever you go to an author's um, book signing, or they would read passages from their book, hearing it from your voice makes it all the more special.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. My kids would tell you they get sick of hearing my voice. I'll tell this funny little story, and then I'll say goodnight. My oldest boy, when he was 12, this boy has no filters at all. He's an adult man now, but still has no filters, and he says everything he thinks. So one day I took him with me to a speaking engagement and book signing for a charity event.
Hmm.
And I'm in the front. I get all my stuff settled, ready to go for my speaking gig. And I see him in the very back of this auditorium, and he's standing there talking to the lady taking the ticket money. And I think, I should probably go check on him before I start, because God only knows what that boy is saying. And I go down off the stage and I walk over towards there, and I hear him say, "They pay money to hear my mom talk?" And the lady's like, "Yeah, she's one of our favorite speakers. She comes every year and does this wonderful charity event and blah, blah, blah." And he's like, "They really pay money to hear my mom talk?" The incredulity in his voice was just dripping.
Hmm.
And I stop in the aisleway and I'm listening, and he goes, "I'd pay her to shut up. All I ever hear is take your dishes to the sink and pick up your underwear. I just don't get this."
That's the best.
If I live to be 100, that will always be one of
Oh,
my absolute
well,
top five stories. I just will never forget that sound of incredulity in his voice, as though it was insane that anybody would want to ever hear him tell a story.
mm. Oh
So,
my. So,
so with
well,
that, I think I will end our stories for this evening, my
all
friend.
right, all right, Patty. So, um, and thank you to all our listeners and viewers. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Care to give them a little teaser of the next episode, Patty?
Well, I've actually been working on a couple really cool episodes. So our next one's actually going to be about giants. Now, it sounds far-fetched,
Mm-hmm.
but I am totally fascinated with them. And the fact of the matter is, the historic record really does indicate they existed. And while I was doing research for this, I found what I have to tell you is some of the most frustrating and compelling evidence that they ever existed that you could find. And I can't wait to share that with you guys, because you're not going to believe what I learned.
Well, We
And
will
it was,
wait.
yeah, it was brought
Mhm.
forward in a court case,
Oh
and they
my.
had to testify to it in court. So when I tell you this, this is stuff that they literally had to testify and confess they did in court. So I can't wait to share it all with you. So until the
Nice.
next time,
All right. Good night, everyone.
good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.